Have you ever wondered what all that stuff is that you see when you shuck an oyster? Well, today we're going to talk about the Eastern oyster and what's on the outside of the shell, and more importantly, what's on the inside of the shell. Oysters are known as bivalves, which means two valves or two shells. Lots of the shellfish that you all like to eat, like oysters, clams, scallops, they all have two shells or valves, as you can see here. And what I want to show you real quick on the outside is that you can see these marks here they look like little circles, and that's actually a barnacle scar. Because y'all know that when you go harvest an oyster, a lot of the time, not all the time, but they might have other plants and animals living on the outside of their shells. Sometimes you see seaweed, sometimes you see like these barnacle scars, and sometimes you even see baby oysters that attach to the outside of the shell. The other thing that you'll notice is that the top valve or shell, it fits right inside the cup. Because as you all know, for folks who like to eat oysters on the half, when you shuck the top shell off, you then are left with this bottom shell or bottom valve. That's the nice cup here. So the next thing that we're going to do is go to the inside of the oyster. You take off the top valve or shell and you're left, with the bottom here. A prominent thing when you open up the oyster that you see, and again, the colors that for the purposes of this, of showing and demonstrating the inside of an oyster, you're not going to see all these colors. When you open it, you mostly see it looks tannish or brownish, but we decided to make some things a little bit different color to make them stand out more for educational purposes. But that being said, when you open any oyster, some of the first things that you're going to notice are these structures here. And these are actually the gills. They're probably the most prominent thing that you notice when you open them. What they do is they actually sort the microscopic food that the oyster eats. And some of you may or may not know this, but oysters actually eat microscopic plants called phytoplankton. And there's lots of different shapes and sizes of phytoplankton. So what happens is the oyster is filtering, they're just big filters of water. They're filtering 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, seawater that they're in. And so what happens is the water comes inside the shell and then goes across these gills where they sort out the food and the oxygen and so forth. So the gills, actually, as you can see here, as the food moves across them, they're sorted and then finally kind of shuffled into the end here and go into the esophagus of the oyster. And from there, they go into this greenish structure, which is actually not green, but we just wanted to kind of highlight it so y'all could see it. Goes into the stomach, where the phytoplankton goes into the stomach here. I just want to show y'all too, inside the stomach, you'll see these different shapes of phytoplankton, these diatoms. And the diatoms are plants, as I mentioned, in the water. They do need sunlight to help them grow too. Again, different shape of some diatoms here. They eat brown algae, they eat green algae, all sorts of microalgae or microscopic plankton called phytoplankton specifically. Many different shapes and sizes here. So I'm going to just tuck those back in its stomach, and then after the food is ingested and goes into the stomach here, it goes through this tube here, which is actually its intestine here. And finally, at the end of the intestine, it goes, here's the digestive gland that actually helps digest some of the food that's in the stomach. As I mentioned, goes through the intestine this way. At the end of the intestine, right here, we come across, actually it goes underneath, this is the heart, which is not red in the oyster, but we just want to illustrate that here, that oysters do have a heart after all. And sometimes when you shuck them open, or you take the top valve or shell off, you might be able to see this thing moving still and beating a bit. At the end of the intestine here we go, at the very end, and the undigested food actually comes out the end here at the anus. I just wanted to show you the little fecal pellets, these little pom-pom balls here. sometimes y'all, if you've ever seen an oyster in a tank, for folks who work in shellfish hatcheries, or even if you don't, sometimes you watch oysters pump out water, you'll notice these little brown pellets coming out, and that's these guys here. But we'll just leave these out for now. The other structures that are in here that you see, and that when you open the top valve, are this here is called the gonad, and this represents where the eggs and the sperm are, the reproductive products are in here, and the oyster, when you shuck it, you'll notice that it may be bigger or smaller depending on the time of the year. When they're getting ready to spawn, it typically gets bigger. As the water temperature warms up, this structure will get bigger and bigger and bigger until they finally spawn out. And it will be much smaller, and usually we see that like in the summer months. Sometimes if you open up an oyster, folks will call them water bellies. When they don't have a whole lot in here, they're spawned out. They've just kind of spent all their energy and just put all that into reproduction. And again, that depends on the time of the year. And that's where the folks might have heard the phrase, eat oysters in the months that have the letter R in them. Typically that's when the oysters are not spawning, when the water is not super duper hot. The other thing that I wanted to show you all is this structure here, this reddish structure, is it's called the adductor muscle. And this is what holds the shells together. That's why when you look at an oyster and the shells are closed, you're not getting it open. So your oyster knife is actually, when you shuck it, it's one of the things that is being cut in order for the shells to be open. And the top shell will have a muscle scar on the top where the two shells come together and where the muscle is kind of holding it in place. The next thing I wanted to talk about was, we're just going to move these soft tissue structures out of the way here, so that way we can talk about the mantle tissue and the tentacles. Okay, so now that we're on the very, very inside of the oyster, let's talk about the mantle tissue and this black structure here. This is called the tentacles, and this, in addition to the gills, when you open up an oyster, you notice the big gills, as we mentioned, that help filter and sort things out, and these also do that as well, the tentacles, but they are more sensory, and you can see they're very fine at the end. They look like little brooms almost, and these are part of this thin layer of tissue, which is called the mantle, this here. And the mantle actually helps secrete, that's a big word for produce, the actual oyster shell. So this is very, very important for the oyster and helping it get bigger and surviving and so forth. I just want to roll this back here a little bit, this mantle tissue, to show you an oyster would not be complete without its pearl. Although every oyster does not have a pearl, you could find it, and I'll tell you, if you've ever eaten an oyster or a clam and you bite down on one, you're gonna know. You're gonna know that there's a pearl in there. And the oysters that we have here in the Gulf usually don't have these big, beautiful, like the jewelry pearls. That's actually a completely different kind of oyster that is grown specifically for growing jewelry pearls in the South Pacific. It's related to the one that we all eat here, to the Gulf oysters, but it's like a cousin essentially. But you know, if a little bit of sand or something gets inside the shells of the oyster, they're gonna cover that up with this very shiny, you know, the pearl material, and it might come out as an oblong, it might come out as a circle, but typically they're usually really small. You don't see them very often, but you might. So next time you eat an oyster, just be aware that you could have a pearl in there as well. Next time you're out at the local seafood restaurant, make sure to ask for Gulf oysters, whether you're eating them on the half or you're having them grilled, however you're eating them. Now you'll know that oysters are a lot more complicated than you might have thought, but of course they're still just as tasty.